Hey everybody. So in this section of our channel we're going to be discussing some of the common objections to Christianity. Now these can vary from everything including you don't have enough evidence to actual objections to the evidence themselves. And so that's what we'll be dealing with. These videos will tend to be shorter than some of our other material, though there may be some that are longer than 10 minutes in length. So for our first video, what I thought I would do is just give some general tips. And this is really some fundamentally basic things, but often they're overlooked or forgotten about. And there's things that have really helped me over the years when I use this myself. Now, I really do use apologetics, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. It just depends on the conversations I'm engaging. I have a number of different religious groups that come to my house on a regular basis, and typically I will interact with these folks. I don't fuss at them, I don't yell at them, I don't slam the door in their face. They get enough of that going everywhere else. If that's your method of dealing with it, everyone's different. My comment there isn't to say that how you're dealing with it is wrong. It's just that I'm trying to find a way to reach them. I also have more time in my day than most people do, so keeping in mind that my door is always open to them, so it's a bit different because of my time, and I find it to be extremely helpful and good practice to be able to answer questions and or just listen to them. What I found is that the more I do listen to them, the more I understand what it is they have to say. And I have to be honest, I've bought and owned books on dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, trying to genuinely understand their religion. And from what I've seen and heard, the books, generally speaking, aren't very helpful. I suppose they could help a Christian struggling with how to answer, maybe to strengthen their own faith, where are the answers to these questions that these people are asking me. But by and large, just listening and asking good questions is going to get you further if you have a decent understanding of the Bible. And then from there you can go and, again, use Google to look up answers to some of these common questions or accusations, if you will, they're going to level at Protestantism or let's just say Orthodox Christianity. So I think the first tip I've already sort of mentioned there, which is basically to listen. Just listen. People genuinely don't care what you have to say unless they know that you genuinely care. This is something that was taught to me in Bible college over 20 years ago when I first heard it. And my professor who was teaching it was quite a brilliant man. And and I think the way he framed it actually was, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And he was absolutely right. I've learned over the years that no matter what you're talking about, that's just genuinely the case. Now, I've since modified it, and if you notice, my original statement was slightly different, and that people genuinely don't care how much you know until they genuinely know how much you care. In other words, what you don't want to do is try to come across as being caring and then not, just so that you can have an opportunity to talk to somebody. In other words, you listen just long enough, or you generate some sort of fake canned questions or statements to get them to think you care about them, and then that gives you the opportunity to launch into telling them how wrong they are. That's not going to do you any good. Again, and no matter what facet of my life I'm talking about, whether it was training soldiers in the military, members on my teams, or students in the martial arts. I'm not talking about children, I'm talking about adults in MMA and Jiu-Jitsu. Or students at Bible college, or whatever it was. These different faiths that come to our door. None of these folks really care how much I know, genuinely, until they know that I genuinely care about them, their well-being and their welfare. And then they tend to listen a whole lot more, particularly when it came to faith with people who weren't paying me for an education or paying a school, There, of course, you do have a more captive audience because people want the information or knowledge that you have. But even in those environments, I find that when you genuinely care about people, they're going to listen a whole lot better, and you get a lot more out of the relationship as a whole. I still have good relationships with most of my students. I still have good relationships with a lot of the folks that come to my door, these different faith groups, because it's not always the case that any argument I give for Christianity is going to persuade them right there on the spot. It used to be, having done door knocking for years when I was younger as a preacher, that I would occasionally get somebody who would genuinely accept Christ right there on the spot. But most of the time that wasn't the case. I'd built relationships with people, and over time they would know that I studied very hard the Bible, and that when they had a question, they knew who to come ask. And because I would listen to them and genuinely cared about them, and we had a good friendship, then when they did have questions, they would start asking me. The last few people I've had a chance to really be able to share the gospel with and see them come to trust Christ as their Savior, they were won this way. It was the fact that I had a friendship with them, and then they knew my faith, my background, and when they had these questions, they started asking me because they knew I wasn't just going to try to beat up on them or bully them. And that gave me an opportunity to share everything. In fact, I remember one of them, he and I were going to where were we going? To training. 3 hours drive one way to a seminar or something to that effect. And what was so cool was he asked me very early on in the trip about the Bible. And I said, well, you sure you want me to tell you? And he wasn't resistant. I just thought, most people don't want to hear about that. And he said, no, I do. So 3 hours one way. Told him all about it. And I thought, well, he's never going to want to, hear about that ever again. On the way home from the seminar that weekend, asked the question again. I said, man, are you sure? Oh, yeah. 3 hour trip again. Then this was a competition we went to sometime after that, and pretty much any trip, and then it became regular conversations about faith until he trusted Christ as his Savior. But there would be trips sometimes that were 2 days. We'd go from Florida to Virginia, if I remember correctly. Ashland, Virginia, I think is where we went, and both ways of the trip, he's asking me questions about faith, about God, about Christianity as a whole, about the Bible. So there again, he knew that this was a passion of mine, that I studied about it very intently, that I genuinely cared about him, and that because of that, he trusted if he asked me a question, I was going to answer it both honestly, and that because I do study quite hard and intently, that I would be a good person to ask these sorts of questions too. That for me has worked. So I would say as an apologetic method and as just in general, a method of sharing your faith, that is one of the best ways I found. And I hear this quite often. I was just talking with a friend about this recently in terms of some folks that he's just been struggling with not knowing how to share his faith with. And every time he tries, there's a lot of friction. And I told him, quit trying to sort of force it on him. And that's not really fair, because that's not exactly what he's doing. And that wasn't exactly how I said it, but I'm trying to be brief here with my explanation. So he said, well, what do you mean? I said, try just genuinely being nice to them. It doesn't mean you have to, if they're doing things that we shouldn't be doing as Christians, don't partake in that. But if you're around these people quite often, just be kind to them. And they'll know your beliefs, your faith, and at some point you're going to get an opportunity to share that with them, because they're going to want to know your opinion on something. And if you're kind, you're an easy person to talk to. People genuinely do want to know answers to these things. And it might be that they just want to know why Christians believe what they believe. So if you're an easy person to approach, you're going to be the one that they're asking those questions to. Again, it doesn't mean you have to cram your faith down anyone's throat in order for them to know that you're a Christian, or wear some sort of lapel pin that says, I'm a Christian, ask me anything. although maybe that would work, I don't know. But the point is that, the more approachable you are, the easier it's going to be. Again, that doesn't mean you can't share your faith with folks, but in this day and age where with social media and everything, I found when it comes to personal relationships that this is one of the most effective means for me. So hopefully that first tip will help you. So then on to the next tip. Okay, so this next one is really basic and often overlooked. Now this is covered actually in Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, and it's also covered in quite extensively in an RZIM course, Dr. Ravi Zacharias' online courses, and I think it's what they call their core module. I took that several years ago, and I found it really good and beneficial, and so I wanted to share that with y'all for any of you who may be interested in doing some sort of online certification. What is the technique? Well, it's just asking questions. Now, before you launch into asking questions, try to just listen. This can be a bit difficult because, to be honest, whenever I'm speaking with somebody and they're really just giving it to me with both barrels, they find out I'm a Christian or a theologian or an apologist or whatever, and they just want to give it to me. This is somebody who maybe has been hurt by Christians in the past, or they've been told that it's just ridiculous, or whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. But they've decided they're going to give me an earful. Well, for most of us, it's we tend to want to give them an earful right back. I mean, let's be honest. That's sort of the human nature, right? Is to defend ourselves, if you will. But we need to remember to listen, because it's going to be very difficult to answer a question with any meaningful answer if we don't hear what it is the person is either asking or telling us. Sometimes they'll say they have a question and then turn around and give us an earful of opinions and maybe some fact-based points, but there's no real question at all. And that may be all that they wanted to do, was just exactly that, give us an earful. And that's fine. But listen first and then ask meaningful questions. Now, what I mean by meaningful is ask questions that aren't aimed at just making somebody angry, but are aimed at getting to the heart of the matter. In other words, try to figure out why they're saying what they're saying. Are they really being fact-based? Are they just being emotional? Oftentimes, I hear ad hominems being leveled at myself, or see them being leveled at other Christians online, and sometimes I want to jump in and defend the other Christian, but I've got to remember that if that person's holding their own, I'm not trying to gang up on the atheist or the agnostic or whatever the person's background is or belief system. In fact, if they're having a dialogue, there's no need for me to get involved at all. So with the questions, I think our main thing should really be to press the individual to try to get clarity. Again, oftentimes, without knowing every single answer that there is to know about theology and the Bible and all the different fields of study that there are, I can generally, through asking good questions, get to the heart of the matter and point out a logical inconsistency or just a wrong-headed way of thinking without ever having to need to know all the answers that there ever are or would be to every single question. So this really helps me quite a bit, and I hope it'll help you. Okay, so my next tip is actually a pretty simple one. I don't hear it being taught very often, but it's really basic, and that is, if you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know. Don't make up answers whatever you do. You're not doing Christianity any favors by trying to just make up an ad hoc answer. It just doesn't do any good. Later on, if you do, and that person goes and looks up what you said, they're going to come back and point out that you were wrong. And if they really wanted to understand Christianity, they're not going to trust you now. Not to mention, their impression of Christians is going to be that we're all imbeciles. And let's be honest, a lot of people already think that. So we don't want to make it harder to explain or give an answer for something. If you don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know. And if somebody wants to rub your face in it, let them. If anything, you want to be persecuted for Christ anyway, in a way. If that's the worst persecution somebody can give to me, well, that's fine. But the truth is, what it shows me is their ignorance as well. Now, not because they're not being the bigger person, but is that really the goal of anyone, to have all the knowledge and to be able to answer every question? No, I don't think so. It's just to have ground in our answers, or to have a warrant, the ability to trust what it is that we're saying, and that it comes from a trustworthy source. So, don't worry if you can't give every answer. Now, one of the things I was taught in the military, which I find extremely helpful, is to let people know, hey, I don't have the answer for that, but I'll look it up and I'll get back to you. And make sure you follow up with that. Don't just tell them that and then not come back with the answer. Go look it up. That is going to save you a lot of trouble. Okay, so my next tip is probably a little more unusual to myself, although I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person who does this. And that is, have a little black book. Now you might be thinking, what? Like that. What this is a little notebook. You can get them at Walmart or other places. You can order them on Amazon. And you probably see that. I take notes in that. Now, I don't take necessarily notes of what the question the person is asking me, and I don't use it to write down things the person has said so I can hold them accountable and throw it back in their face later on. That's not what it's for. Typically with this notebook, what I do is I write down or take different notes in it on fact-based points. And this thing came in extremely handy a few years ago. I was sitting at the VA, and I was, I don't remember what I was doing, reading a book, I think. I was waiting for a doctor's appointment. Veterans Affairs office is where I was at. And I overheard a conversation, and there were two people ganging up on this guy that came into the VA with a t-shirt on with a picture of somebody who it was intended to look like Jesus. And these two folks were just abusing this poor guy. Now, they weren't being vulgar. They were just telling him, oh, there's no, good information for Christianity, and there's just no facts, and just giving it to him with both barrels. And I'm sitting over trying to mind my own business. I'm quite a ways away from them, but they're being very loud. And I just kept trying to ignore the situation. And the more I did, the more it was bothering me. And so finally I said, all right, if I go over there, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to ask questions. And I'm going to ask permission to get involved in the conversation. So I got up and went over. And most veterans are pretty nice, particularly, fellow veterans. You go over, we can be a little bit more gruff with one another. But I was pretty polite. And I sat down. I said, can I get in on this conversation you guys are having? And they were very nice. Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. So the gentleman, the main one who was really going at it with this guy, who's giving him such a hard time, was saying that there's no, now let me see if I can quote him correctly, there's no evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed. Now, this is a fairly old claim. Most scholars today, modern biblical scholars, now remember, biblical scholar does not equal Christian all the time. There are plenty of atheist scholars that deal in universities with theology. So don't think for a second that means that, we're talking about only Christians. So back to my point. Most biblical scholars agree that Jesus Christ was a real person, that he really existed, and that his followers truly believed that he had risen from the dead. Doesn't mean that the skeptical scholars agree that he actually did. Obviously, if they're atheists, they're not going to believe that. But they believe that he was a real person. All right? So I asked the guy, well, what do you mean by that? Where are you getting that information from? And he said, well, my father looked up all the ancient Roman documents and couldn't find one mention of the name Jesus Christ. Well, first of all, that's a big whopper of a fishtail there, and I pretty much saw it for what it was. Now, it's possible that the guy's father somehow had access to every single archive of ancient Roman documents and could read what was probably Koine Greek at the time. Yeah, but probably not, and there's a number of reasons why. What they teach in colleges, where I studied in original languages, when you learn Koine Greek, for the most part, you're learning how to read it out of a Greek New Testament. And the font type is different than what you're actually seeing in most of the older documents. The the stuff that we get in the Greek New Testaments has spacing between each word. It's written in, think of it as lowercase, it's really what it is, and it's much easier to read. When you see it on the ancient documents, though, it's generally all uppercase, and if you're not reading Greek like that all the time, believe it or not, it is different. It's not like our English alphabet where you can always, because you grew up reading it, you can always make out the difference. So it's a bit tricky. It's also the case that the words don't always have spaces between them, and so it can actually be rather tricky to read, particularly if you're not fluent in or proficient in reading these documents all the time. Well, then I asked him, I said, what was he looking for? And he sort of looked at me bizarre, and he said, well, the name Jesus Christ, of course. I said, well, okay, but Christ wasn't Jesus' last name. He said, what? I said, you said he was looking for the name Jesus Christ. Well, yeah. I said, well, I don't know what kind of a scholar your dad was, but Christ wasn't Jesus' last name. It's a title. Now, that doesn't mean the document wouldn't have carried the name Jesus with Jesus Christos. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't have contained the name like that. But I said, do you know happen to know if your father looked for Jesus Bar Yosef, or some sort of permutation of that? He said, well, why would that matter? Well, because that would be more likely how the name would be listed on a document. Jesus, son of Joseph, basically. Well, it doesn't matter. There's no proof that Jesus Christ ever lived. I said, well, what do you mean no proof? I said, I'm sure you're not going to count the Bible. Well, yeah, of course not. Okay, well, what else would you accept as evidence? Now notice lots of questions. Well, anything not coming from a Christian. So, pulled out this little book and flipped to a section that I had written down listing a lot of sources. And I said, well, what about Suetonius? He said, what? I said, yeah, he was a Roman historian, a court official under the Emperor Hadrian, and I just, read off to him what I had. Well, no, I said, not Christian. I said, well, I don't think Suetonius was a Christian, but how about Josephus? Well, no, I said, no Christians. I said, Josephus was a Jew, he wasn't a Christian. And then I proceeded to rattle off several more. What about Marpar Sarpian and several others, and Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, so on and so forth. And I explained to him, look, not all of these are saying, or any of them are saying, that Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, but they're all affirming that he was a real person, and they're either contemporary with his time period or within the time period of those. Most of them are within the time period of the first, his disciples, the first century, and he didn't like that too much. He got up and walked off. I was being really, really nice. But what happened? Well, I took an argument that was essentially nonsense and just shed some facts on the situation, and it changed the tempo quite a bit. The other individual that was giving the guy a hard time started in with, well, I've seen the ancient documents, and they're not real, they're corrupted and whatnot. Once again, well, what do you mean by that? Which documents? Well, the golden manuscripts. So the golden manuscripts. Now, what are they? Well, they're a document from 1000 AD, roughly. Come to find out later on, guys, and I'm glad I asked, they're not a manuscript at all. They're a collection of writings from Christians and whatnot, and they date to around 1200 AD or so. I could be wrong. Might be 1300. So they have nothing to do with that. I was pretty suspicious already that a document that late was something she was going to cite as a good reason to believe that the New Testament had been corrupted beyond trustworthiness. So I started asking some more questions. So you read Koine Greek? Oh, yeah. I said, well, and this was sort of a dirty trick, because I was already pretty suspicious. When I write any Koine Greek in this book, whenever I write Greek words, I actually use Koine Greek. Now, you won't probably be able to read that, maybe you will. But what that's basically is that's an ancient, the Jesus fish that everybody's always doing, that's the acronym for that is ichthus, which is fish, right? That word, but it stands for something. It's a device. It's Jesus Christos Theou Huios Suter. So that's translating Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. All right? And so that acronym, ICDUS, stands for that. Now, that might seem silly that I'm pointing that out, but I said, well, yeah, what did you think when you learned this? I didn't tell her what it said or anything. And the person bluffed for a second. I said, well, how would you translate, what do you think about that last word? I mean, do you really think that means creation? Well, it doesn't mean creation. Well, yeah, it could mean that, or it could mean this. It didn't mean that at all. I realized really quickly that the person couldn't read Greek. So I stopped them and I said, actually the word means Savior. I think the word you're thinking of is a different word. And anyway, I'll keep the story shorter than I already have. But the point was I cut right to the heart. And because I had that with me, I was able to pretty much get down with it. And I tried to be as nice as I could when I did that. It wasn't my objective to be cruel. It was just to point out once again, like with the first person beating up on this gentleman, that if you're going to claim that you have this sort of knowledge, then you got to have it. You can't just make accusations and not have the supporting material. You can do it, but it's not going to go well for your argument. But I was just, was very friendly about the whole thing. I didn't barge over there and start telling them how wrong they were. I started asking questions and listening, and I used this black book of information to cite things. Now remember that. Take your time whenever you're giving an answer. Don't feel rushed. Don't feel like you need to just give the answer right away, or that you don't have a minute to look something up. But if you're going to look it up, make sure you know where it is, like in a little black book like that. Or if you're going to use your phone, which is fine, make sure you already have an idea of the website and the material that you're trying to cite. Because otherwise, you're going to take forever. They're going to get bored. They're probably going to think you don't know what you're talking about. And it may not help you as far as citing that information. So have an idea of what you're looking for. Don't just get on Google and go, okay, evidence for the New Testament. That's because, again, you don't know if what you're citing is correct or not if you haven't had the time to vet that information. So be careful with that. Make sure that it's information you've already vetted as being accurate and trustworthy, and that it's something that you can cite and have confidence in it. So again, I prefer this. Oh, one last thing on this with this paper notebook, and that is that one of the things that really helps me with this isn't just that I have it to carry around with me to cite these facts. I keep the facts very short and bullet point, but the act of writing them down, researching, finding the data, and then writing them down and recording them helps me a lot. I'm a physical or tactile learner, and so just the act of writing it down really helps me to remember it. And even if I can't remember it verbatim, I generally have a pretty good idea of where I put it in that little book. So it helps me, if I don't remember it word for word, to know where it is. So it's pretty quick for me to access it. Whereas with my cell phone, the battery could die on it. I could not have Wi-Fi or internet reception, in which case I can't, look up the information. So, I just find it helpful to have that paper book with me. And it is a great resource. All right. On to the next point. Last point is really more on the book, and that is just remember to keep whatever you put in there relevant to the types of questions you generally either get asked or the types of questions you might see online. Generally, if you're like me and you're on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, YouTube, and you get a lot of questions or you see them being asked, whether they're in chats or wherever, you're going to see a repetitive nature to the questions. You're going to see the same types of questions being asked or accusations being leveled all the time. When that happens, it's going to give you a pretty good idea of what information you need to have on hand. And then secondly is, don't try to write a novel. These books are small, and for a good reason. Okay, and I like that, so I can keep it in my back pocket. This one's got a nice curve to it. You probably can't see that. Because I carry it with me all the time, and so I need something small and lightweight. So I need to be able to just jot down some real simple notes. So, usually name, date, sometimes source if it's important, where I got that information from, which I like to try to have that information accessible, and then if it needs anything other than that basic information, I want to try to write it as short as I can. Also, keep it legible, because it doesn't help if you can't read your own writing when you wrote it in there. I try to write in cursive most of the time. I find that my penmanship is far better. So for me, that really helps. Keep it organized. That's the other thing. When I first started this one, I didn't really have a method. So I just started writing stuff down, and I made sure to leave myself room if I was skipping around. And that's fine. When I go to do another one of these, I'll be transferring information out of this one into another one, and I can sort of narrow it down and put stuff in it more like in chapters, if you will. But, just keep it basic and simple. And again, if you're the one writing it, it's going to be easy to have access to that information because you know what you put in there. I don't mind making a cheat sheet for people, but I find this type of thing far more helpful for me if I do it myself. If I download somebody else's information or I buy a book like this, if I was to make these and sell them, I don't think certainly wouldn't do me any good to buy somebody else's. Because even though I'd have access to the information, I wouldn't, because I didn't make it and because I didn't research it, I wouldn't own the information like I do right now. So I find it extremely helpful to take time to make something like this. And listen, you don't need to, this is a work in progress. I've been doing this for two or 3 years now, I think. It's not done. I'm not in any rush. I take it with me. When people ask me questions, if I don't know the answer to, I write the question down in here, and now I know what my next thing that I'm going to research is going to be on. And again, I just try to have bullet points, references, or whatever. I tend to try to write references in my paper Bibles, my print Bibles, but I don't always have those with me. And to be honest, I tend to look at the notes in there and pass right by them because I'm so used to having notes in my Bibles over the years that I forget that that's what I'm putting the notes in there for, is to help when I'm talking to somebody. And so I just fly right by them. I had that happen recently when talking about Jesus Christ being God to somebody, and passed every note I had put in my Bible, all the verses that I had been doing research on, and all the Greek, and all of that. Just flew right by it all. Couldn't remember any of it. It was a very frustrating experience. If I just put it in this thing, when I pulled it out to access it, it would have been much easier and more helpful. I did manage to get through that session talking to that person, but it could have gone a lot better for me. So, I hope this has been helpful. Again, these are really basic tips, but the idea is just that. Keep it simple, and you're going to have far more success than if you make things overly complicated. And remember, you don't have to answer everything all at once. Most people that are objecting are doing it because they don't want to object outright without a reason. So they're going to look up reasons, but it doesn't mean that they either A, fully understand them, or if they do, that they've really done a ton of research. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't people out there who haven't, but most of those people tend to be very cordial and are very easy to talk to, in my experience. Most guys that are highly educated in these fields, even if they're skeptic, atheist, whatever, from my experience, tend to be, I love hanging out with those guys. Because when you're working at that end of scholarship, you realize how much evidence is really there or isn't there, and how fine of a line it is between being right or being wrong sometimes on certain subjects, and how strong or weak your position is. And so it's just like when I used to fight competitively, that up at the black belt divisions in jiu-jitsu, the guys there at that level generally were pretty cool when I'd compete against. And they weren't tending to bang you into things and trying to hurt you. Yeah, we were all trying to win, but it was just a much more pleasant environment than competing at the lower levels. Because you realize how easy it is to lose, just either A, by having a bad day, or B, by making one simple mistake, and that other guy's just as good as you are, and he's going to capitalize on that. So you're aware of the level of skill going on there. And in argumentation, it's kind of the same in that you're much more aware of all of the data that's actually available, how strong, again, or weak the arguments really are. So don't be afraid of any of it. Don't be afraid to lose an argument. It's not like, God's going to strike you dead with a lightning bolt, and you're going to learn from it. It's going to make you stronger. Again, Used to tell my fighters that if you lose a match and maybe you get caught with an arm bar or a triangle choke, you'll never lose another match by that, or at least not one for a long time from that technique. And the reason why is you're going to go back, you're going to remember how it happened, and you're going to do all the research you can to prevent that from ever happening again. So, it's okay. And now, unlike these guys in jiu-jitsu, we don't want to be bitter, all right? It's not that at all. But, we want to be prepared to give an answer, always, to the reason of hope that's in us. And we want to do it with meekness or gentleness. We want to respond with kindness. Doesn't mean we don't respond at all or that we withhold the truth. It just means that we do it with love. You could tell somebody the truth without beating them up. There's nothing wrong with that. So hopefully this has been really helpful. I've enjoyed doing it. And, if you guys have any questions, as always, hit me up. You can leave comments down below. If you disagree, leave comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like. It helps us to move forward with doing more videos. And again, even if you don't like anything I'm saying, you want to debate with me, the sooner we get more likes and subscribers, the sooner I can do live streams and whatnot. So, thank you guys so much again for your time. I appreciate it. Take care, and God bless.